One day, when you are back in Malaysia, I bring you over and visit my house.
Ah, lovely. Yeah.
Okay, we are live. Oh, someone click live with you. Okay, hi. So far we've got 24 and rising, 29 participants.
Yeah, 42 now it says.
Yep.
Going up and up.
Yep,
Very
going up. So a lot are signing in. Thank you very much. 47, 48. Thank you very much to everybody who signed in. $72. Wow. Okay. Panel, shall we start by doing a casual introduction first? Huh? Okay. We have 78. All right. Excellent. Thank you so much. Good afternoon to all the participants. I think there's still people signing in. There's now, as of now, the 81 attendees. Thank you very much. I am Richard Wee from the firm of Richard Wee Chambers. I would like to thank AIAC for this kind opportunity and the invitation to moderate this very interesting event. And I had the opportunity to have a chat with two renowned sports law personalities. One of them is my friend, Mr. Nick DeMarco from Blackstone Chambers in UK. And another one more, a formidable officer from the Australia's Players Footballers Association, Miss Angela Collins. We will invite them to introduce themselves shortly. We just wait for maybe another 30 seconds more while people are still logging in. I would like to thank everybody who is logged on to watch and to view this webinar. We will be laying down some house rules later before we start. Oh, people, we've got 96, Angela. Nick, 97 now. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, very
okay.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the attendees. 98. All right. Thank you. 99. Okay. Looks like good. Oh, 100. All right. Thank you so much. 100 attendees so far. Thank you. Okay. Without further ado, let's start. This topic of discussion will revolve around sports arbitration. Before I set the tone of the discussion, may I first invite Miss Angela Collins to introduce herself, maybe share with us what she's doing in Australia, what's her work, and we can hear from her later her experiences in Australia. Angela, all yours.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks to the team at AIAC for this opportunity. It's very exciting in some obviously challenging times to talk about such an important issue. So thanks to everyone that's tuned in to hear us discuss these important times. So as Richard mentioned, I'm Head of Legal at Professional Footballers Australia. So we are the exclusive collective bargaining agent for the professional players in Australia. So that is our national team members, both our male and female national teams, as well as our male and female domestic premier competitions. We also obviously have a number of professional players that are applying their trade around the world. So a lot of my job takes time in that sphere and running cases through the Court of Arbitration for Sport. I was recently made an arbitrator at the FIFA DRC, which was exciting. So I'd obviously been running a number of cases through that jurisdiction in my 6 years at the PFA. So hopefully we'll be able to talk about this issue, which is really fluid. Things are changing day by day, certainly in Australia, and what's happening worldwide. So we're all just working our way through, but hopefully we can have some good discussions today.
Excellent. And congratulations, Angela, on the appointment to the FIFA's NDRC. Well done.
Thanks very much, Richard.
Yeah. And without further ado, can I invite my good friend, very learned and experienced football lawyer, and also a strong barrister in England, a Queen's Counsel, Mr. Nick DeMarco. All yours, Nick.
Thank you. Well, good morning from London, where it's about 10 o'clock in the morning here. We're all getting used to this kind of thing, speaking to each other over video. And it's actually quite interesting because I've spoken before at a couple of AIAC events, and it's involved flying out to Malaysia, which is always a great pleasure. But interesting to see how we can do such an international event like this on video, and how much this may be the future for lots of us as lawyers and practitioners in sport. I'm an independent barrister working now exclusively in sports law, commercial and regulatory disputes in sport, and I act therefore for many different sides, for clubs, for players, for leagues, for agents, and so on and so forth. At the moment, probably the two most relevant things I'm doing in relation to the current crisis is I'm advising one tournament about whether and how it should end itself, and if it does, how it should deal with its results. And I'm also advising the PFA, the UK counterpart to Angela's organisation in Australia, the Players' Union in England, about its whole approach to wage negotiations, salary cuts or deferrals, contract issues, employment rights, and collective bargaining, and so on. So I've got a great deal of interest in this area.
Excellent. I think I will speak on behalf of AIAC. We are very, very pleased to have two very experienced speakers in the areas of sports law to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on sports. So we welcome both Angela and Nick on board to have a talk. I think most of the participants who have signed in are mostly in Malaysia, though I see some of the participants are probably not from Malaysia too. So welcome aboard. There are 122 so far who have signed on. Thank you very much for logging in. Now, today's basis of discussion, we will be discussing about a hypothetical case, a simple hypothetical case where we will then take this case and look at all angles with regards to sports law. The case revolves around an ongoing sports tournament, an unnamed tournament. We won't name the tournament and we won't name the location of the tournament, but the tournament was ongoing until there was a lockdown in that tournament's country a few weeks ago. So a few weeks ago, that tournament was suspended due to the lockdown of that country. One of the first issues we have to discuss, and I would like to invite Angela first to take a first bite at this issue. Angela, what do you think will be the ramifications of suspending a particular tournament with regards to the perhaps the results, the final tally, final table of the tournament? All yours, Angela.
Well, I will disclose that obviously I will be talking mainly from a football perspective, given that that's my day in, day out duty. But I think a lot of the principles that we're talking about today can be applied across different sports. I think one of the challenges that I see, you have two brackets, so to speak. So the actual suspension of the league, the postponement, cancellation, whichever it might be, and how that looks in terms of results. Will that finish? Will it go beyond its original date that it was required to be finished by? So that's in terms of the technical suspension. A lot of what I have been looking at is what happens in the event that, from a regulatory perspective, it does go beyond the date that it was originally supposed to end. And certainly in football, this is a very big issue from this perspective. The first issue, what happens is there's been much discussion around this particular issue with FIFA, FIFPro, the European Clubs Associations and the World Leagues Forum, to where FIFA put together some guiding principles around this. So what happens in the event a player is due to come out of contract at the conclusion of the tournament? but it has been suspended and then it goes beyond that date. What happens? Can a club or league unilaterally extend that player's contract? Well, obviously from an employment law perspective, we would say no. What happens if that player has signed a contract in another league that is due to start at a different time where there's overlapping seasons? Who gets priority? Where does the player go? Because he may still want to see out the season, but then is due to start in another league. So there's a whole range of complex issues, which is why I'm perhaps talking in a roundabout way, but it's not really just a simplistic answer. So FIFA has put together some guiding principles, and what they have looked at is that if a player's contract is due to expire and it extends beyond, the suspension extends beyond the original end date, that really that would be good if the player could play out the end of that season for competition integrity perspectives. Having said that, it would have to be by agreement. And this is a principle I would assume across all sports and all types of clubs and leagues and cases, that any kind of decisions that are made in these respects for employment related issues really should be done on a collective basis. And that is something that FIFA is pushing quite strongly with regards to this. And certainly from a player's perspective, we do believe that the best outcomes are going to be from collective discussions with all the social partners. And you will probably hear me say that a lot during this presentation, but that's certainly where we're coming from. So,
okay, that's a good start. Thank you very much, Angela. I think you've set the tone on what's happening. Of course, we'll take football as an example. It's a popular sport. I'll come to Nick shortly, but before that, there is to inform all the 124 participants. Thank you very much for logging in. You may post questions to the panelists. Below your screen, you will see an icon Q&A. You can click on it, type in your questions. We will try to answer all the questions, but of course, I think it's impossible to attempt all. Later on, we'll try to group all the questions together, and then we'll post it to the panelists to try. And of course, the Q&A, we'll probably start attempting it, say at about 5:50, 5:45, 5:50, giving us about 20 minutes or so to do the Q&A. To all the participants. So type in your Q&A, we will try to attempt it later. Okay. Now, so Nick, so Angela has mentioned, well, she gave the example of football, and I know you are also very well versed with football. What have you observed so far with regards to the steps and the ramifications and the steps to take pertaining to the finality of the results of a particular tournament? So in your case, maybe the English Premier League and the English football leagues from the championship all the way down. All yours, Nick.
Well, I think the first thing to say whenever speaking about this subject is, of course, all of us, whether we're sports lawyers or involved in sport in any way, our main concern at the moment is the health crisis itself and getting over the health crisis. And that sport is subject to that and is following that. And in fact, in England, it's important to note that it was football itself as an industry which postponed itself, because at the time football was suspended in England, the Premier League, the Football League and so on, the government of the UK was still saying it was safe to go to mass gatherings and mass tournaments. So it wasn't a situation like in many other European countries where the government banned mass activity. In fact, we had what's called the Cheltenham Racehorse Festival go on at the weekend just before football postponed itself, where you have about 300,000 people collecting in a very small area, traveling there by train. A lot of people said this is very dangerous, but the government's advice at the time was this isn't a problem. But the pressure came from the football industry itself, from the players' union, from the clubs, from those involved, saying this is dangerous and we will suspend football ourselves. And I think that was the right decision. And of course, about a week later, the government then itself banned mass gatherings. So the first point is all of these discussions we're having about the legal ramifications are obviously subject to and follow from the actual health issues. And that's why the biggest problem at the moment is that there is no certainty at all about how the health crisis will develop and resolve itself. When we look at the Premier League tournament or the Football League tournament, or indeed any league tournaments, and to a large degree, the decision in the Olympics very much mirrors this. There are effectively three options which can resolve this. One is what you might call cancellation, declaring a tournament or a league null and void. And in fact, that's already been done with non-league football in England, a decision, very controversial decision by the Football Association, that all non-league football has been declared null and void, all the results expunged. And that means you treat the season or the tournament as if it had never happened at all, and the results don't stand. The second way of resolving the crisis is to postpone the tournament. So that's what's happened with the Olympic Games. And so far, it's the approach in football generally at the elite level. It's the approach favoured by FIFA and UEFA, and in England by the Premier League and the Football League. And the idea there is to postpone the tournament until it's safe to play again, and then to resume the tournament. And that has many advantages I'll come on to in a second. The third option is to have what you might describe as early termination, but not cancellation. So you terminate the tournament now, but because you've already played 3/4 of the tournament, you try and devise a system by which you award promotion and relegation and titles and so on, money, championship prizes, to those who have won, or who have deemed to have won. And those are really the three, there are variations of those things, but those are really the three options that arise. The reason why, both with the Olympic Games and with football, and with many other tournaments, particularly those where there is a lot of money involved, the reason why postponement is the preferred option is fundamentally a commercial reason, and one in order to avoid legal disputes. It's also, of course, in many respects, the best option from a sporting integrity point of view, because most sports fans and most sports people would like to finish the season and for the season to be decided by events on the pitch and not by lawyers deciding or officials deciding and so on. So it's the most attractive in that sense, but there's a fundamental commercial reason for it, because broadcasters, for example, in England, invest literally hundreds of millions of pounds in rights to broadcast the Premier League all over the world, in the same way that sponsors and broadcasters did for the Olympic Games. And if you cancel the tournament or bring it to an early end, then you're going to have massive legal disputes between the broadcasters and the sponsors and the event organisers, which could cost the sport hundreds of millions of pounds. And so that's why if you can deliver the product somehow by postponement, that's the preferred option. But there are real problems with postponement. The Olympic Games was not easy, but perhaps obvious that you postpone it for a year. How long do you postpone football for? Well, none of us know, because none of us know when it is safe to play football again. One of the things they've discussed in England is the possibility of playing football behind closed doors, perhaps later in the summer, and extending the season into late summer or even into the autumn. But even if you play football behind doors, you have to do it at such a time when you have mass testing, so that you can ensure that all the players are safe to play with each other. They're going to have to train for at least 2 weeks before that season starts. You're going to have physiotherapists, match officials, broadcasters and so on there behind closed doors. So you're going to have a quite large gathering of people, and it's going to have to be safe to do so. And we simply don't know when that will happen. And if the result of a postponement is that the season doesn't end until October or November, all of which are possible in England, given we have not yet reached the peak of this health crisis, then you get so far into the next season, which is currently meant to start in August, that you might run up against exactly the same problems as you're now having, which is the broadcasters saying, hold on, we've paid hundreds of millions to have this season, and you're now only giving us 3/4 of a season because you've made it shorter. And so there are real problems even with the postponement approach. And then finally, if I can just quickly on the early termination. The difficulty there is, again, you still have the problem with the broadcasters saying we haven't had what we've paid for, so you've still got that dispute. And then the other difficulty is, how do you determine? It might be easy, and I know you're an Everton fan, Rick, so you may disagree, but it might be easy to say it's obvious that Liverpool would have won the Premier League, so award them the title. Angela's a Liverpool fan. So, you know, certain things may be easy, but let's look at promotion from the Championship in England. And remember that if you get promoted to the Premier League now in England, it's worth the best part of £200 million to a club in the first year, and then more later, because even if you get relegated, you get parachute payments. So it's worth a huge amount of money to get promoted. There's a lot at stake there. 2 clubs have automatic promotion. You may even be able to decide that. But then what about the 3rd club that gets promotion from the playoffs? The playoffs are made up from the teams from in the 2nd position down to the 6th position in the Championship. Well, we know who those are so far, but other clubs who are only a point or 2 points behind will say, well, we were on an upward trajectory. If the season had continued, we could have been in that position. Do you have playoffs? If you have playoffs, why not resume the season? There are so many questions about how do you determine this. And the only thing you can guarantee is that however you determine it, there will be winners and losers. And there will therefore be some clubs who say, hold on, this decision is costing me potentially hundreds of millions of pounds. And therefore there's going to be the risk of legal action as a result of that. So as I say, that's why postponement is by far the best option for most people, but only if it's possible, and it may not be possible.
Yeah, very interesting. I think you really covered what's happening in UK. And in fact, I notice here we've got some 7 questions already, many of it connected to what you say. But I'm going to go to Angela because Angela, I think Nick has set the tone for what he observed is happening in UK. He has very clearly put on 3 potential options to deal with the tournament, which is either to cancel the tournament, to postpone the tournament, or to have an early termination. From your angle, from representing the players, how does the players view the ongoing suspension? All yours, Angela.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Richard. And the players ultimately want to play. And it's a really difficult balancing act. As Nick mentioned, the priority in all of this has to be the health and welfare of the players. Now, we actually started the season, we're right through the season, but before there was the lockdown, we had a round of matches that was played behind closed doors in Australia. And then due to further government restrictions, that just wasn't going to be possible. We couldn't actually even do any further rounds because borders in different states were having isolation rules of you have to stay in isolation for 14 days if you travel into New South Wales or travel into Victoria. So it was just making it very, very difficult. The players obviously concerned about it being a contact sport and transmission. You know, everyone's told to social distance, but then you have players out on a field and obviously there are health ramifications. So the players were wary about that, but ultimately they're happy to postpone and they're hopeful that this may lift that situations may change. And
Mm.
certainly from their perspective, they would want to see out the season, definitely.
On that point, we'll come back to what I like the way you said it, because basically the players, they are in their heart and their mind, they want to play like any other professional player.
Certainly.
Yeah. Cricket, basketball, if you ask the NBA players, they can't wait to get back to the court. But since we're on that point, do you have any observation and any comments that you may have seen with regards to the global, particularly for football, because of your industry, a global request from clubs and owners of clubs for players to take a pay cut, a review of the salary? Would you like to have, do you have any comments on that? And maybe you can give us some observations.
I could talk about this all day, Richard. Predominantly, that's the issue that I'm dealing with significantly at the moment, both in Australia and for players that we do have overseas. And likewise with how a tournament's going to proceed, clubs and leagues have really elected to take different paths. The first obviously being, no, look, you're still a player, you're still performing work despite the suspension or postponement, we will pay you in full. There are other clubs that have either unilaterally asked the player or told the players that they're going to have their salaries cut, and that may be a decision not just by the club, it could be the league or the federation as well. We've seen some examples of that. Then there's clubs and leagues and federations that are engaging, like I said, with the collective discussion, which is the preferred approach, that any discussions around the impact of a contract amendment, particularly in relation to remuneration, have to be done in consultation with the social partners. Because these are really, really complex issues that we're dealing with. You're looking at, okay, what does the employment contract say? What is the jurisprudence or the national laws in this area? And that's another point, because there's so many different national laws that they have to be taken into account as well. But we're finding that clubs and leagues and federations that are being really transparent in the nature of whether or not they're getting funding from a broadcaster, whether the sponsorship money has dried up, the actual impact that the remuneration or lack thereof is having on the financial and economic flow and viability of the clubs and leagues. When that information is understood, there's much a greater appreciation and a willingness to collaborate, rather than an example that we saw recently where a club in one of the top divisions in Europe hadn't paid their players for 3 months and said, well, look, we'll pay you 2 of those months if you agree to a 50% pay cut for the next 9 months. Wow. You know, those are the kinds of things that are happening, and that's a very extreme example of that. But across the world, I'm in a lot of contact with the other player unions around the world, and some are achieving remarkable results just from having that social dialogue.
Good. I like the discussion, because that's really one of the issues which will eventually lead to the issues of sports arbitration.
Definitely.
Because, yeah, I think I can share with you, Angela, I think even in Malaysia, specifically again about football, even though we are speaking about a general tournament which has been suspended. So for football, FIFA, as you mentioned, have come up with a directive. Number 1, try to negotiate. Number 2, look at your national law. 3, meet the players. Worst case scenario, clubs take a unilateral approach to do what they have to do, which I think if they do take that, is going to hell break loose.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that. The thing that we're trying to avoid, I suppose, is the law of the jungle, where everyone's just doing anything that they like. In circumstances where a unilateral approach is taken, that would certainly be examined by the FIFA judicial bodies. Was it reasonable in the circumstances? Was an attempt made to have that social dialogue? Is the national law applicable? So there's a whole range of things that would need to be considered in the event a unilateral decision was made and is then ultimately questioned before a FIFA judicial body.
Yeah. Well, even the same thing, before I go to Nick, I'm sure Nick would have some experience in this issue. There are some comments from NBA, for example, the National Basketball Association, among the first tournaments to be suspended. NBA may want the players to take a 50% cut, and the union is counter offering 25%. So that they, even in US, that is ongoing. And as you know, US, they are ravaged by the coronavirus. They are quite in bad shape. So I don't think NBA, to be honest with you, will ever take on this year. I think they have to cancel the whole league this year. So that's something.
And they're very complex. Yeah, they're very complex discussions to have. And they're, as I said, the health and safety aspect with the economic aspect. It's looking at where do revenues come from. And I think moving forward in the sport, I think we could see quite a big shift in terms of business models within leagues and clubs.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have had some very, very good questions so far. We'll come to them soon. Hold on. Nick, so we've spoken about the potential ways to resolve the tournament, the ramification to the tournament which has been suspended. Then Angela mentioned, I spoke to Angela being the stakeholder for the players' side. And of course, we end up talking about the salaries for the player. What can we do? So on your side, Nick, anything have you observed? Have you been approached by any parties to deal with this issue of potential wages and salary cuts in England for sports?
Yes, well, as I said at the beginning, I'm advising the Players' Union here in England on that, and so have been involved in their strategy. But because I also act for a number of clubs, before I started that instruction, I'd heard a lot from clubs about the situation they were in. And it's actually been a huge political controversy in England because there was a lot of stuff in the media, in the press, sort of saying football, Premier League players who earn hundreds of thousands a week, which, you know, there are a few at the very elite end who earn those sorts of salaries. They're obviously a tiny minority of football players, but the focus was on them. They should take a wage cut because of Corona. And there was a lot of pressure in the media about this. And then the government health minister publicly said, he sort of condemned Premier League players and said they should take a wage cut and so on. And whilst all that was going on, there was actually discussions going on between the PFA and the clubs and the Premier League about how to deal with all of this. And two important points were made. In fact, many of them made by the Premier League players themselves. The first is that if players take a wage cut, what that means is the club gets the benefit of the wage cut. So if a player is earning 100,000 a week and takes a 50% wage cut, the club makes a saving of £50,000. That's kind of obvious, but when you then see what the motivation for the pressure on players to take wage cuts was, and in England, it was a lot to do with, well, what about the NHS, the health service, the health workers and so on? You should take a wage cut to help them. The wage cut doesn't help the NHS in any way. It actually, and the footballers made this point, may harm it because the tax of footballers play is almost 50% of what they receive at that level in salary. And that goes to the government, which pays for the health service and so on. So if they take a wage cut, that is reduced by 50% if it's a 50% wage cut. And it's going into the pockets of the clubs as opposed to the pockets of the government and the health service. So this is an important distinction that, in fact, the footballers made themselves. And they said, look, they're happy to make wage cuts or deferrals or donations and so on. They just want to know where it's going to and that it's for a good cause. And of course, there are clubs that will need players to make a deferral or come to some arrangement because of the effect on their immediate income. But the other point that players make is that that's obviously fine for clubs who need that to survive. But there are other clubs in England who are owned by multi-billionaires who, yes, like everybody, we're all going to suffer as a result of the economic crisis. They will be suffering, but they'll still be able to to carry on funding themselves. And so why should the players take a wage cut in favor of those multi-billionaires? So it's not as easy as simply wage cut or no wage cut. And in fact, a lot of the discussion in England is, well, let's at the moment look at deferrals, negotiated deferrals of wages as opposed to cuts. Because if, as I said earlier, the preference is for a postponement of the season, the reason for that is that you're hoping you can actually play it out to its end and receive the income you would have received in the end. And therefore, a deferral may make some sense of the salary, a postponement of the salary or part of the salary for a period of time. But a wage cut is something completely different. So those are the arguments going on at the moment in football here, I think, and I think they'll be mirrored elsewhere.
Yeah, very insightful, Nick. Thank you. I think you took us into the inner world of the current conflict, in particularly for soccer, football. On that point, I might also try to attempt some questions here. A question coming from Nikolaus. I hope I pronounced the name correctly, but my apologies if I didn't get the name correctly pronounced. Inquired about the elements of force majeure. From your observation, Nick, before I go back to Angela, have you seen the activation and the triggering of force majeure in any sports contracts or football contracts so far?
Yeah, I saw Nikolaus's question, and I also saw a number of the other questions that deal with frustration.
Yes,
and I can answer those together, perhaps, because
yes, let's do that. Yes, yes.
In English law, and I know in Malaysia and in Australia you have the common law system. So I assume these things are similar in Malaysia and in Australia, and they are different, by the way, in Europe and civil law in Europe, and therefore FIFA, UEFA, which is governed by Swiss law, has a different approach to these things. And it's not completely different, but it's a different approach. But in the English common law system, force majeure is something parties can agree to and have in their contracts, as Nikolaus suggested. It's not a principle of law, but we do have the principle of frustration. With frustration, you need to be able to demonstrate, if you're the party wishing to get out of your obligations under a contract. So imagine you're a football tournament and you don't want to pay the broadcasters because it's not your fault that the season had to be cancelled because of coronavirus. You have to effectively prove that it's impossible for you to render your contractual obligations. And that's the main reason why postponement and other alternatives like playing the game behind closed doors is being so heavily considered at the moment. Because if you imagine tournaments just today said it's impossible for us to perform our obligations and simply cancelled everything, it would be much more difficult for them to rely on the doctrine of frustration, because it could be said, well, why didn't you try to perform your obligations in some different way? For instance, by postponing the season and finishing it later, or by playing games behind closed doors. So in order to succeed on a case of frustration, you need to really do all you can to try and render your contractual performance. And that's, as I say, one of the reasons why postponement's a preferred option. The same really comes into play with force majeure. If there are force majeure clauses, and you can guarantee that in the football broadcasting contracts, there will be force majeure clauses. They're all confidential clauses, so we haven't seen them, and if we had, we couldn't talk about them. But those clauses will usually list types of events.
Exactly.
Which will be force majeure events. And this, I did an article about this and looked at clauses in a number of published sports contracts. Some would list this type of event, some don't list this type of event. So you can't guarantee that this is a force majeure event unless the parties have agreed it's a force majeure event. And of course, the other point is government intervention, where governments have advised tournaments don't go ahead, and then the tournament itself is cancelled. That may have a very different legal implication to where a government order has said you cannot have a tournament. because that again is more likely to be a listed force majeure event. But then even if there are those force majeure clauses and it is an event, you still have to demonstrate that you've done all you can to render the performance. And if there, again, depending on the terms of the clause, but usually if there are ways in which you could do it by some other way, you need to try and do that. Or there may be some other procedure for resolving it. So all those things will depend on each individual contract. And going back to the earlier question, and footballers' contracts, there isn't anything similar to a force majeure clause in a footballer's contract. And that's certainly true in England, but looking at sort of FIFA contracts generally, I assume that that must be true worldwide with all football players' contracts. And people had asked about frustration in England. Would it be possible for a club to say the contract between the player and the club is frustrated, the player is unable to play football and we're only paying him because he plays football, so we're going to be discharged from our obligations? And it would be, in my opinion, very difficult for a club to succeed on that for a number of reasons related to employment law and so on. But there's also a big problem for clubs, which is why I don't think they will go down that route at the elite level anyway. It is when you have the doctrine of frustration, it's not something you can elect to rely on or not, ultimately. It's not like termination for breach, where you can accept the breach and terminate the contract, or you can sue for damages and continue the contract. If a contract is frustrated, both parties are discharged from their obligations under that contract. And if a club is able to prove that a football employment contract is frustrated because of coronavirus in England, the logic of that is that all football contracts will be frustrated as a result. So all players will be able to walk out of their contract. And clubs will not want that because the players are their assets. So frustration doesn't work for professional football contracts, really.
Thank you for saying that.
Interesting point you raise. I am aware that there is not a Premier League club, but a top division club in Europe that did terminate the contracts of, I think it was 9 players on the basis of force majeure. And my understanding is that is because that they didn't accept to pay cuts. So I know that that is getting challenged, or that will be getting challenged through the FIFA jurisprudence. In terms of whether a player can reasonably perform work, it's an interesting issue at the moment in Australia. Several clubs in Australia's league have elected under national industrial law to stand down players. And that is on the basis that they cannot supply the work and there is no work for the players to actually perform. Now, certainly we wouldn't agree with that, because you're looking at the obligations under an employment contract are very multifaceted. And I think we may have all seen the clip of Jose Mourinho with the Tottenham squad doing the conditioning sessions on the Zoom. You know, there's things that can happen, and a lot of obligations under an employment contract that are beyond the training pitch and the 90 minutes on a weekend. There's image rights use, there's media appearances that players can do, a multitude of things where they can actually perform work. So that's an interesting component that we're dealing with in Australia.
Actually, Angela, I was about to inquire, from your observation in the players' contracts, as what Nick mentioned, in FIFA, he hasn't seen any. Have you seen force majeure clauses in the
Not that I can recall recently, certainly. I don't see them.
Yeah, I don't think so, yeah. In fact, Nick, thank you for saying what you said, because I've been trying to tell that to a lot of clubs, who, and not just clubs, even employees, that if you simply trigger this issue of frustration or force majeure, and in a case, for example, like Barcelona, if they choose to have force majeure, they may lose Lionel Messi for free. You know, so it's not as easy as that. You know, so it is an obvious element of contract law which most lawyers may want to advise. But from a sporting point of view, a sports lawyer will never advise a club to simply trigger force majeure or frustration. They may have massive consequences. So on that point, can we now slowly go towards issue of conflict? Because clearly now we're talking about conflict, parties of conflict. Earlier on, Nick mentioned about the potential media, millions of pounds were paid or Australian dollars were paid to broadcast certain matches. So I think it's safe to conclude that after the global lockdown, there will be much litigation, there will be much disputes. How do you think, number one, let's first deal with the Court of Arbitration for Sports now, and the sports arbitration around the world, because we also have sports arbitration in Australia, and in Malaysia, of course, we have AIAC holding court. From your observation, Nick, number one, currently, how do you think CAS conduct their hearings, if there is any?
Well, the CAS have prohibited all in-person hearings until at least the 1st of May this year. So there are no in-person hearings in CAS, but there are still hearings taking place, and CAS's preference is for hearings to take place by video conference, so like we're doing now, but in the context of a hearing. That's the same position with sports resolutions in England, which is the largest domestic UK-wide arbitration for sport. They also have stopped all in-person hearings and are having hearings by video conference. It's also the position in the English courts. There are now video hearings taking place. The courts are still open, but they're not open for in-person hearings. And I expect that will continue over the next at least month or 2 months, and perhaps longer. So hearings, I don't think will stop. Some will have to be adjourned because for all sorts of reasons. But I think generally sports disputes will continue to take place, but they'll take place by video hearing now, and not by in-person hearings. And to some extent, that may make it easier for international disputes to be listed and determined, because you don't need to get all the parties in the same place at once. It's important to note that most of these disputes that we're talking about potentially arising, we've spoken about the player and club disputes, and of course there are particular arbitration forums that deal with them, and ultimately the CAS deals with a lot of those on an international level. But the commercial disputes we're talking about between broadcasters and sports tournaments or clubs and sponsors and so on, nearly all of those disputes, certainly the ones I've looked at previously in other contexts, are subject to arbitration clauses. And those arbitration clauses might be in CAS, but they're rarely in CAS. They're much more likely to be determined in commercial arbitration centres, such as the AIAC or the SIAC or the London LCIA or whatever. And so I think there will be a potential for a lot of those arbitrations taking place. Those arbitrations are in any event behind closed doors and are not public hearings. And in a lot of those cases, they're quite savvy and advanced compared to domestic courts in having hearings by video, or at least in cross-examining witnesses and so on by video. So one would hope that they could continue and will continue and make good use out of their facilities to do that. There are problems and issues. One problem generally, which might not affect sports arbitration as much, is the right to a public hearing, which is certainly a right in England. I think in Malaysia as well, in Australia, public access to the courts, public hearing, reporting and so on, open justice. How do you do that if you're having a video con? And they've already started trying to deal with that in England, talking about broadcasting court proceedings that are on video. And that may arise in some arbitrations because of the recent Pechstein-Mutu decision, of course, in certain important sports disputes where athletes' rights are restrained, there can be a right to a public hearing. The other practical problem that certainly I'm beginning to worry about, because I've got a sports arbitration next week by video, is how to deal with things like cross-examination. Because I think many of us may be used to, I am used to cross-examining a witness by video, but when everybody's in a room, we're all in court together or an arbitration together, and we've got one witness on video who we're cross-examining. Now that's not, it can be challenging because of the links and so on, but it's not that difficult. But if we're all in separate places, and you know, I'm a barrister and I've got my instructing solicitor in a separate place with her lay client in a separate place and a judge somewhere else and my opponent somewhere else, and we're all linking in, you know, obtaining your instructions, objecting to the other side, all these things become more difficult, and exactly how that plays out doing it by video, I think, is something we're all about to learn.
Well, we're going to go through the same thing here, Nick. In Malaysia, we are trying to experiment with online hearings, and all the litigation lawyers, I had a webinar, I hosted a webinar on Tuesday last week, specifically on this point, and we're all trying to figure out how are we going to cross-examine a witness, and now we suspect the witness will probably have all the answers hiding below the screen, waiting for us, whatever question we are there. So anyway,
can I just say on that point that we've already dealt with that whenever we've had, in a number of football arbitrations, I've had a witness on video who I've had to cross-examine, and we've always had it so that they've got a lawyer, someone you can trust, in the room with them, supervising them when they're being filmed to make sure that's not happening. But interestingly, I'm not sure how you do that now when, you know, you can't send a lawyer around.
You can't send a lawyer. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, Angela, very interesting discussion by Nick on arbitration and maybe litigation matters. In your view, taking into account your current negotiations in your capacity as the legal representative of the Footballers Association, do you foresee any potential dispute which may then escalate towards either a court or arbitration? And if it does, what are your general comments about such a dispute? All yours, Angela.
Yeah, look, I think Nick summed it up perfectly, the challenges that everyone's going to face in terms of sports arbitration. I think one of the biggest issues, certainly at the global level in football at the moment, is access to arbitration. As I understand it, a number of national tribunals within the football system have effectively shut down as well. You might recall just earlier me using that example of the non-payment that the players had for 3 months and then having it held over their head for another 9 months on a salary reduction. Well, that particular country has shut down their national tribunal, which is making it extremely difficult for those players and the union as representatives to actually challenge the club on that particular issue. So that's just a bit of an example. I think in wider terms, we're going to see a lot of, litigation, a lot of cases between players and clubs in terms of unilateral terminations that are going to happen as the shutdowns continue, as leagues potentially get postponed further, which means that revenue won't be coming in. Those are things that I'm advising players on at the moment, players that are being approached by their clubs to basically say, we can't afford you anymore, we need to let you go, but wanting to do it on a mutual basis, but really putting pressure on players to basically agree. I think that may come to the fore when players and clubs can't agree in that respect, to see what action the clubs may take. I think we're going to see a lot of non-payment issues come through as well. Hopefully, I'm still remain hopeful that everyone can engage and come to collaborative decisions. But I fear that in many countries, especially in countries where there aren't player unions, that is going to be a problem. So I do anticipate that there will be a number of problems there as well. Yeah. And one of the issues that I've actually been grappling with today, not grappling with, so to speak, but discussing with a number of players is foreign players and being allowed to return to their country of origin. And then what happens if they can't then return to the country where they're contracted to play due to border restrictions, those kinds of issues. The human rights element of all this, the human right to health, the human right to a private life, to family life. I think we're going to see a lot of those fundamental rights be brought up in challenges around disputes between players and clubs.
Oh, brilliant, Angela. I think you and Nick have really listed down all the potential scenarios which we may see be brought to conflict. Of course, I don't think we can answer all questions, right? It's because it's almost impossible for us to clairvoyantly give accurate solutions.
I'd love to have a crystal ball, Richard, but unfortunately, as I said at the start of this, and I'm sure Nick would agree and yourself, that this situation is just evolving so rapidly that day to day, certainly from my perspective in the work that I'm doing, the day-to-day conversations that I'm having with players, both in Australia and ones that are situated overseas, it's just changing so frequently.
I recall at the earlier part of the dialogue, you even mentioned that things were very fluid. I think that was a very correct statement to put for this topic. I wouldn't be surprised if we hold this dialogue next week, we will have a different view, so on certain issues. Yeah. Let's try and attempt some of the questions posed. I think we've got really good questions. I would like to thank all the participants. Thus far, we've got 117 now. At the peak of the event, I think we had about 130 people logging on. Thank you so much. We have a question here. Maybe Nick may want to try it first before I go back to Angela. A question about what are your views pertaining to sponsor? One gentleman, I think it's gentleman, Balbase Jesse, asked about, can a sponsor now reduce the sponsorship to, say, for example, 40% because they were not getting the ROI, the return of investment? And can the club, on the other hand, take such sponsors to arbitration? That's one issue. And another question above here talk about about media rights, basically cancellation of media rights. So, Nick, you want to take a shot at this question?
Yeah. Can I also say, I see that we have 20 questions, and this is another good example of these webinars actually being a good thing, because when I've spoken at events before and you're in a big room and then you say, who's got any questions? You're lucky if you get 2 or 3 hands up. But obviously people are more willing to answer questions in these events. So that's very refreshing. On that question, a lot of it depends on what we've already been discussing, frustration and force majeure clauses and so on. So they will come into play again. To take a typical example of either a sponsor or a broadcaster, if there's a force majeure clause in that contract, then it will depend on the wording of that clause, and it will depend on whether or not, if a party is trying to rely on it, it has taken reasonable steps to perform its obligations, for example, by postponing an event. And if postponing an event is a reasonable step to perform your obligations, then it's not a breach of the contract. So the broadcaster or the sponsor couldn't win on that point. But whether it is or is not will depend again on how that clause is drafted and how it's construed by the courts. And you'll have different interests here, because you can imagine a lot of companies now are under, not just in sport, but in just about every sector except the people who make Zoom. A lot of companies now are under severe financial pressure, and they might be sponsors of an event. You take 2 examples, betting companies and airline companies are 2 areas of industry which are obviously under extreme financial pressure at the moment. And those 2 industries are probably involved in the heaviest amount of sponsorship in English football. You might have a case where a sponsor simply needs to try and get out of a sponsorship contract whereby they've got to pay the next installment of a few £1 million or dollars, and tries to rely on the current situation to do so. So you're going to have these disputes, whatever the law says, because there's an economic imperative that's going to mean these disputes are going to arise. And I can't give a general answer as to whether broadcasters or sponsors can get out, because in each case it will depend on the contract. There will be arguments on both sides. But can I just say one more thing, so that we're not too depressed by the end of all of this? Because yes, there will be a lot of disputes that arise, but there's also, as Angela has said, and we've been talking about in relation to players and so on, there's a fear, a legitimate fear, that the pressure on sport overall is going to lead to a huge financial crisis in sport, and lead to some clubs going under, simply going bust, and a reduction in wages and so on and so forth. And these things are real problems and real dangers that everyone's doing their best to avoid, and reflect the real dangers of an economic crisis in society. But we will eventually get over this health crisis, and sport will come back. Whereas there are perhaps some things we're already learning in lockdown. Do we really all need to pay high commercial rents on offices all the time? Or can we work from home more? Do we really need to travel as much? Or can we help the environment by traveling less? I don't think anyone said, do we really need sport? Most people are just keen to see it back when it's possible to have back as an entertainment. Sports and entertainment will continue to be a big industry, and it will take a hit, but it's not the end of the world, and it will rebuild, and it will continue to be a very big, popular and lucrative industry, in my view.
Yeah, I like the way you put it. But thank you, Nick. But I suppose you're spot on with regards to issues of potential conflict. It really is down to the wordings and the phrases and the intention of the contract before we can decide on what we can do next. But Angela, on your side, let's look at this other point. A question was posed towards you, to Miss Angela. Considering that you have stressed on the importance of reaching an agreement, would mediation be the appropriate method? So early on, so another question from from Andreas, asking the same thing, whether we can promote ADR. Do you think, Angela, that instead of maybe parties going to court or arbitration, would parties consider mediation?
I would think that if it was going to help achieve an outcome that was going to be satisfactory to all the social partners, I think, why not? Really, I think in this kind of climate, I don't think that there's anything off the table. And if a mediation, if we're going to have collaborative discussions, which are going to be very complex and difficult, if that can be achieved through a medium like mediation, then I'd certainly wouldn't dismiss that.
In my personal review, Angela, I've noticed that, in fact, over the years, we have also advised some of our clients to use these kind of services, is the online mediation. So there's already an existing online mediation. Maybe something...
I think it'd have to be online now, wouldn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So
You'd have all the different parties in all the different rooms. I think, yes. Nick, the other day you were saying something about the bad sandwiches.
Yeah,
you get it,
exactly.
Yeah.
And nice lunch while you're having mediation.
Cooking for lunch instead of horrible sandwiches.
So there you go.
I think that's an alternative, definitely.
Yeah, I think so too. I do agree with you, Angela. It makes sense. And I can see in the way you are running things, Angela, you are, in your heart and your mind, you're trying your best to avoid the matter escalating to go to court or arbitration. That's very good. I think as a lawyer, we all know, try your best not to litigate if you can. So I suppose the mediation is something we should plant onto the mind of the stakeholders, and I really hope they can mediate and avoid litigation. Another general question here, maybe for the both of you, a question from an anonymous attendee. What do you think of the impact of COVID-19 on the Formula One season? Something different now. Angela, you want to try?
That is very different. I must confess, motor racing isn't my forte, but interestingly enough, we did have the Grand Prix cancelled in Melbourne at the start of March, and that was before we had the quite severe restrictions on social distancing and the regulations that we have right now. I think it was the correct decision. From my personal perspective, I think it was the correct decision at a time when things were really teetering on the brink, certainly in Melbourne at the time. But as for the ramifications, Nick may be better placed to answer this question than myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be serious ramifications, as Angela says. I mean, it's a lot of the issues are the same issues you've seen in other sports, but there are perhaps two particular additional problems with Formula One. First of all, as a commercial enterprise, this is a very successful commercial enterprise, a key part of its commercial success and revenue flows from the fact that it arranges its races in a number of different countries throughout the world. And so you have the franchises from those different countries. And the obvious problem is that this is a global crisis. And whilst it may be possible to resume sport in one country earlier than another, the Formula One season, depending on being in certain different countries throughout the world, gives that added layer of complication. One way around that might be to organise the races not in the schedule they were planned to be organised, but in those countries that first become safe to organise the races. So that the thing that's a problem may also be part of the solution for Formula One. The other problem with Formula One is because of those international races, the extent of travel and the logistics which is involved in organising them is incredible. The number of aeroplanes that have to be used to fly not just people, but cars and parts and spare parts and so on throughout the world for every race is huge. And again, you might find a country which can host an event, but you might have half the countries where equipment or people have to come from being unable to attend. So there are very great logistical problems for something like Formula One.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just had a chat with our organisers from AIAC. They have kindly informed us, because there's so many good questions, we may be able to stretch this up to Malaysian time 6:30. But Angela and Nick, do you have to go somewhere? Well, you can't go somewhere else, but do you have any other? Do you have to respond to? Do you have to respond to maybe another teleconference after this? Am I eating into your diary? Can we extend?
I think we could take a couple more questions. But then
okay,
I may have to scoot off.
Yeah. Should we do a compromise and extend it a few minutes and then and get on with other stuff?
Okay. So we'll try to complete everything by 6:15. So it's only 6:07, 8 more minutes. Okay, let's do this. Fantastic. So over here, I also saw a question here, a very interesting one from Dan Raj. He asked, will football clubs be compensated for players' contracts which has run down or expired throughout the Covid-19 lockdown period? Angela, you want to try that? I repeat.
Sorry, could you just repeat that, Richard? Because it was just breaking out a little bit.
Yeah, I repeat, sorry. Will football clubs be compensated for players' contracts which have run down or expired throughout the Covid-19 lockdown period? So basically, a contract which expired during the lockdown period. Do you think the football clubs will be compensated for that?
No,
I don't think so too, right?
In the ordinary course, they are employment contracts. They're fixed-term employment contracts. They, in the ordinary circumstances, come to the natural conclusion at the end of those dates. But this does form an interesting component of what I was talking about earlier, that if those contracts were to be extended because a league is extended, how clubs are going to be able to afford that. You know, they wouldn't have probably budgeted for additional salaries for another 3 or 4 months. So that's a further consideration. But no, in terms of compensation, unless it was an agreement between the federation or the league and the clubs, but not to my knowledge, no.
Nick, you want to try? Because after this, I want to ask the last questions and then we can wrap it up. Do you want you want to attempt to answer the question?
Yeah, I agree with Angela completely on both points. First of all, no, they could. I don't understand who would compensate them, but the only compensation presumably could be from the player for breach, but there wouldn't be a breach. There is no breach involved as a result of that. So no. But secondly, as Angela says, the real issue here is about extending contracts. And so much focus has been on extending contracts to stop players walking out. So in most football contracts, where certainly in Europe, where the season is during the winter and spring and autumn, the contracts end on the 30th of June every year. So if the season's extended beyond the 30th of June, you're worried about the top players moving out of the clubs, even perhaps joining rivals. So FIFA, as Angela has said, has come up with various ideas to try and stop that. And a lot of the focus has been on how you might be able to extend player contracts. And I again agree with Angela, you can only do so by consent. But if you introduce a sort of regulatory system to try and promote the extension of contracts, which I think FIFA may be thinking of, the problem with that is, what about those clubs, and in England there are many clubs lower down in the leagues, who, to be fair to them, can't wait until the contracts are expired because they can't afford to keep paying the players. They don't want to be forced or required or even encouraged to carry on paying those players. So there's a real problem at both ends with this difficulty of extending contracts. It's not an easy one to resolve.
Yeah, good point. I like it. And the last question. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are many good questions, but I think some of the questions actually was already answered during the discussion itself. But this one last question, I want to pick it up because we didn't talk about this at all. From Beverly, I'm sure you heard about they want to ask about, this person want to ask about insurance. I'm sure you heard about Wimbledon, the organizers redeeming the insurance, which they paid a premium of £2 million, I assume, per year. What is the impact on insurance during COVID? Nick, you want to give it a try?
Well, again, I'm going to give this really annoying lawyer's answer. So it depends on your your terms, your insurance terms. Because as I understand it, Wimbledon had got specific, good terms of insurance that insured for this type of thing. So they were, as I understand it, able to. I haven't followed it closely enough, but they were able to try and claim under it. Other sports events are unlikely to have insured for global pandemics in the same way many governments didn't prepare for it. So the first point is it will depend on the terms. And the second point is insurers are notorious for trying to find out ways to resist claims, obviously. And so there are likely to be arguments again as to whether or not the insured has done all they can necessary to avoid the loss. So it will, in each case, depend on the terms. It will be, as the questioner asked, an important legal question and an issue. There is likely to be litigation arising from it.
Yeah. Angela, is there any insurance coverage for all the professional football players in Australia?
Yes, there is. And that's part of our collective bargaining agreement, that we have insurance coverage for all of our players. And obviously at this particular time, when we are dealing with players that under industrial law have been stood down from duties, we still have them training at home because it's a requirement that they have to maintain their fitness all the time, irrespective of whether they're going to the club all day. We certainly, that's been a big issue for us here to ensure that those insurance coverages are still in place because the players are still performing work.
Excellent. Yeah. On a personal note, I can share with the two of you that, ironically, I just had a general chat with an insurance broker about this. And the conclusion that during my conversation with that person is that we foresee insurance industry for sports will definitely have to take into account such a pandemic in future. And we may see a rise in premium. There will be some changes in insurance. I'm quite sure of that. So lawyers may get involved in that one day. So with that in mind, we've come to a conclusion to our session. I am going to... can I first invite all the participants to give a cyber applause to Nick and Angela from in London and in Austria. Thank you very much for sharing your time. Yeah, yay, you know. So thank you very much to our two speakers. I personally thought you spoke from directly from your knowledge. You both clearly know your stuff, and I think you shared a lot of inside information, and which some of it were probably not too obvious to take into account, but I think you made it now clear with everybody. So I wanted to congratulate the two of you and thank you very much for spending time with AIAC on this session. Thank you very much.
No, thanks very much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And I now like to invite Miss Irene from AIAC. Who would like
thank you so much, Richard. Thanks so much. I'm very sorry to everyone for this surprise appearance at the end of the webinar. On behalf of the AIAC, I'd like to thank Richard, Angela, and Nick once again for taking their time off to speak at our webinar. It's been enjoyable and educative for sure. Thanks for everything. Thanks for being so cooperative during the whole organization period. Also to all the attendees, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your enthusiasms. You know, AIAC is very thankful to have such supportive stakeholders. And if I just make one last note, I promise this is the last note. There are 2 more webinars for this week. One will be held tomorrow, one will be held on Friday. Tomorrow, our panelists will speak about the 2020 economic stimulus package in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for Friday, we will cover the way mediation will go forward post-COVID-19, which is hopefully sooner than later. I think that's all the AIAC would like to convey for now. Thanks again to the 3 of you. And I wish everyone good health in these trying times. Thanks again, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Angela. Stay safe in London.
Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. And thank you to all the participants. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.